The chronological Gospels, the acceptable year of the Lord, the life and 70-week ministry of the Messiah. I'm going to read some from the introduction. The Gospel narratives clearly show us that Yeshua did not go up to Jerusalem for the Passover, referring to the modern version of John 6:4, instead of keeping a feast in Jerusalem. Yeshua assembled thousands of Israelites on a hillside in the Galilee and fed them with leavened barley loaves, John 6:9, which would have been a blatant violation of the Torah if this were truly the time of the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. 2 days later, Yeshua taught another large assembly in the Capernaum synagogue, who also did not go up to Passover in Jerusalem. Instead of delivering a message relevant to Passover on the Sabbath, he taught them about the prophetic significance of the Day of Trumpets, John 6:28 through 59. That year, Yom Teruah, the Day of the Trumpets, coincided with the close of the Sabbath at the end of the 6th month. See calendar appendix, 7th month, 4027, page 379. Yeshua was expounding on the prophetic significance of the Feast of Trumpets that would commence at the sunset on that very day. 3 days after the Sabbath teaching in Capernaum, Yeshua assembled another group of nearly 4,000 men and fed them with another divinely multiplied store of leavened barley loaves, Matthew 15:32 through 39, Mark 8:1 through 9. On this occasion, a group of Pharisees from Jerusalem have arrived in Galilee to confront Yeshua and his followers on the issue of breaking the rabbinic Tanakh, man-made laws that concerned their ceremonies of hand-washing before eating bread. In this incident, the ceremony of hand washing before eating bread. In this incident, even the ultra-Orthodox Pharisees showed no concern about keeping a feast in Jerusalem, but were themselves in the Galilee during the Phantom Passover to investigate the reports that Yeshua was teaching his disciples to disobey the invented rules and religious regulations of the rabbis. During the following 2 weeks, Yeshua began his journey to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, which occurred exactly 6 months before Passover, John 7:2-10. Every gospel author clearly shows that he never did go up to Jerusalem for the Phantom Passover, indicated in John 6:4. Furthermore, if Passover really did occur in the 6th chapter of John, and if Yeshua went up to the Feast of Tabernacles at the beginning of the 7th chapter of John, what did Yeshua do for the 6 months leading up to Passover of John 6:4, or for the other 6 months leading back to the Feast of Tabernacles in John 7:1? Does it make sense that all the 4 Gospels records are suddenly dead silent for an entire year? No. The 6th chapter Phantom Passover is a nonsensical theological forgery. Those conversations in the divine requirements concerning the feasts know that either something is seriously wrong with the 8 words of John 6:4 and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh, or there is something gravely wrong with Yeshua. If the 8 words of John 6:4 were not added by forgers, then Yeshua was in direct violation of the Torah, the very commandments he swore he did not come to destroy or change, Matthew 5:17 through 20. If the 8 words of John 6:4 were not added by forgers, then John has recorded prima facie evidence that Yeshua cannot be Messiah, since he deliberately disobeyed the Torah and did not fulfill its mandatory commandments. Deuteronomy 4:2, 12:32, 13, 1 through 5, 18, 15 through 22. If the 8 words of John 6:4 were not added by forgers, then every gospel account of the week-by-week ministry of Yeshua stops abruptly and is dead silent for an entire year, except for the Phantom Passover and the iniquitous feast of leavened bread, supposedly celebrated in the Galilee. The additions of those 8 words to the later texts of John's Gospel artificially extended the ministry of Yeshua to build a foundation for replacement theology in pre-testary eschatology. And brief replacement theology is the concept that Jesus started a new religion that mysteriously replaced the eternal covenants with Israel. Preterist eschatology goes on from there to teach all the scriptures and prophecy, including the Revelation, were fulfilled by 70 Common Era, opening the door for the Vicar of Christ to rule from his millennial throne in Rome. To support this position, it was necessary to artificially fulfill all 77 of the Daniel's messianic prophecy, and it would take exactly 7 more years after Yeshua's ministry began to make the invented replacement Christology work. So a 3.5-year ministry of Messiah was invented by Eusebius, and an additional 3.5-year period was inserted by interpretation from the book of the Acts to give Eusebian's dogmas theological credence. The support for this doctrine, however brilliant, was manufactured out of the thin air of the 4th century Constantinian theology. Clement of Alexandria, Tertulla, Origen, and Lactantius, early church fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as well as Philastrius and Gardentius and Alvigrius and Orosius and Ephraim, and a half a dozen other theologians cited by the Catholic Encyclopedia under the chronological of the life of Jesus Christ, all concur that the Messiah's ministry lasted about 1 year. It was Eusebius in the 4th century whose first expression the notion of Demonstratus Evangelica 106.8 that Messiah's ministry was 3 years and a half, which is half of a week, in obvious reference to the 9th chapter of Daniel. Eusebius claimed to have deduced this from John's Gospel without ever providing proof for such a claim. In fact, he contradicted over 300 years of the undisputed testimony from the eyewitness, their disciples, and the 200 years of the historians that followed them. Eusebius' assertion was based on nothing more than his own historians that followed them. Eusebius' assertion was based on nothing more than his own interpretations of Daniel's 70-week prophecy, a prophecy that even Isaac Newton was unable to accurately decipher. Rome's indisputably authority was that sole basis for the demanded obedience to this heretical Eusebian's eschatology dogma, and yet the Catholic Encyclopedia clearly acknowledges that Eusebius was the sole progenitor of the pedantic pontification. One can determine anything one wants when all percipient witnesses died hundreds of years earlier, and when all scripture is sequestered from the general population. Unfortunately, time hardens groundless dogma into tradition, which trumps truth in all too many instances. Catholic Encyclopedia, chronologically of the life of Jesus Christ, relative chronologically the public life of Jesus, Restoration, newadvent.org, Cathan. The first Passover of Yeshua's ministry is recorded in the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of John, while his last Passover begins in John chapter 12. From the testimony of the 2nd and 3rd century scholars, it is obvious that the early text of John's Gospel, the only text to which these men had access, could not have included the additional 3rd Passover of John 6:4. It has taken well over 2 years to span these Passovers. These early historians were reading the original text long before the post-Eusebian forgery was added. They all concurred that the ministry of Yeshua was about 1 year. There was not one dissenting opinion voiced in the ranks of Christendom during the first 3 centuries. This simply means that no one even considered then what modern Eusebian theology insists today, that Yeshua's ministry was longer than about 1 year. Furthermore, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record just 1 year in the ministry of Yeshua, It is absolutely impossible to squeeze out more if one understands the feast. The resolution of this problem is obvious, and the internal evidence conclusive. The first century text, to which early church scholars had access, could not possibly have contained the 8 words of John 6:4. A second fatal error was interpreted into John's Gospel with the same maleficent motive to artificially lengthen Messiah's ministry by adding another year of dead silence into the Gospel testimony. Yet another fictitious Passover was interpreted into the text where it clearly does not exist. This was done in John chapter 5.